The living room lights were still spilling light when Emily Harper vanished from the small town of Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Population 8,211. A late autumn night had settled over Buffalo Valley with a thin, cold layer of fog that made the cobblestone walks around the neighborhood wetter and darker than usual. Late that evening, Emily's neighbor, Mrs. Linda Crowley, waved through her kitchen window as the 19-year-old college student, arms wrapped around a neatly folded sweater, crossed the narrow strip of lawn that separated their two modest colonial homes. Emily was returning the cream-colored sweater Mrs. Crowley had lent her earlier that afternoon, a piece the older woman had kept for nearly 25 years. Mrs. Crowley watched Emily's figure dissolve into the light, swirling fog in the backyard. The navy coat she wore the last visible splash of color before the darkness swallowed her whole. What happened in the next hour plus would haunt Lewisburg for more than 2 decades. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss the latest cases. Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, late fall 1996. The damp, cold air drifted between the rows of wooden houses set back in the valley, the pale yellow streetlights reflecting off the fallen leaves that blanketed the sidewalks. The town still kept its usual quiet rhythm, a place where any strange sound stood out, and nighttime silence was something the locals were used to. That evening, 19-year-old Emily Harper came home, after being out with friends. She stepped onto the wooden porch, said hi to her parents, then went straight to her room, looking tired but relaxed. The way any kid does after a long day. No one in the house noticed anything odd. The sound of Emily's bedroom door closing was the last sign that she was safely in her own space. The night passed in Lewisburg's typical stillness, no unusual noises from the hallway, the backyard, or the little road out front. No one woke up in the middle of the night, no one heard a door open, and there was no sign anything strange had happened. The next morning, when Emily's mother knocked on her daughter's door to wake her, there was only silence inside. The door was opened, the room tidy, the bed made and untouched. But Emily was gone. At first the family thought she might have gotten up early and stepped out for a minute. But when calls went unanswered, they started checking every room in the house, then the front yard, the backyard, the porch area. There was no trace she had walked out the door. No purse missing, no coat taken, and no sign at all that Emily had left the house during the night or early morning. The vague worry quickly turned into clear dread when they called her name over and over with no reply and searched the whole property without finding a single clue. Everything in the house was exactly as it had been the night before. Everything except Emily. In that tense moment, as the family looked at each other with quiet but growing panic, they realized this wasn't just someone being late or a simple misunderstanding. Finally, when the fear became too much to calm themselves, they called the police to report that Emily Harper was missing. Lewisburg police received the missing person call from the Harper family early that morning, when the dispatch center was still pretty quiet, and most calls were about minor traffic accidents or small neighbor disputes. A 19-year-old girl disappearing from inside her own home was immediately flagged for fast response. 2 officers were sent to the scene and arrived in just a few minutes at the house on the edge of the town's quiet residential area. When they walked in, they immediately sensed the tense mix of worry and confusion in the family. They asked for a detailed account of the last moments before Emily vanished. The exact time she got home the night before, the fact that she went to her room, and as far as the family knew, never left again. And the discovery that morning when she was no longer there. One officer did a quick check of Emily's bedroom and noted that the bed was untouched, clothes weren't disturbed, and there was no sign she had packed or prepared to go anywhere. They asked specifically about the personal items Emily would normally take if she left the house. Wallet, keys, coat, walking shoes, and everything was still exactly where it belonged. The officers noted this as significant because it ruled out the possibility that Emily had simply gotten up early and left on her own. The family was asked to recount everything they remembered from the night before, every tiny detail about sounds, doors, lights, anything unusual, no matter how small. While one officer spoke with the family, the other walked to the nearest neighbors to gather information. A few said they hadn't heard or seen anything unusual that night, except for one household on the side of the Harper house who thought someone might have walked past the backyard gate, but it was dark and they hadn't paid close attention, so they couldn't be sure. The police wrote down that statement as something potentially useful later. When they returned, they started putting together a list of last known contacts, family, the friend she had been with the night before, and anyone seen near the Harper house around the time Emily was believed to have come home. The list was built mostly from the family's statements and the initial neighbor interviews. The officers also did a general assessment of the house and surrounding area, no signs of forced entry, no furniture out of place, no clear evidence of a struggle or outside intrusion. Still, the fact that Emily disappeared while all her personal belongings remained, combined with no evidence she had left voluntarily, forced police to treat the case as suspicious from the very start. All the information was quickly compiled into an initial report, with a note that the risk level here was higher than a typical missing person case. Right after finishing the on-site documentation at the Harper house, investigators moved to the next phase, collecting statements from anyone who might have seen Emily in the hours before she vanished, starting with the group of friends she had been with the previous evening. Several confirmed that Emily left the gathering in good spirits, no arguments with anyone, no signs of unease or worry. Those who walked part of the way home with her said she seemed completely normal, and no one noticed any car or stranger following her. Those statements reinforced that, up to the moment she left her friends, Emily was not in any immediate danger. After finishing with the friends, police went back to the neighborhood around the Harper house to canvass more homes. One witness in the house behind the Harper's backyard said they saw a figure walk past the fence that night. They couldn't describe appearance or face because the backyard lighting was very dim, but they were sure it wasn't anyone from the Harper family and that the person was moving slowly, as if watching something. Police considered that detail significant. It was the first real break in the picture of the night Emily disappeared, even though it wasn't enough to draw conclusions yet. From all the statements collected, police tried to pin down the exact window when Emily was definitely inside the house after coming home. The family confirmed that after she went to her room, no one saw her leave or heard any activity. From that point until her mother found the empty room the next morning, no witness placed Emily outside the house. With this limited data, police built a rough timeline. Emily left her friends in the evening, arrived home acting normal, went to her room with no indication she planned to leave again, and then disappeared at some unknown point during the night. Even without cameras or direct witnesses, they marked 3 main points: the last time friends saw her, the time the family says she got home, and the next morning when she was discovered missing. Those 3 points, even without precise times, formed the basic framework for possible scenarios. Police kept cross-checking statements between the family and neighbors to see if anything suggested Emily had gone out on her own during the night. The fact that all her essential belongings were still in her room, along with no signs of doors opening or noises, made voluntary departure unlikely. Still, police laid out 2 main theories: Emily left the house voluntarily while the family was asleep, or someone else took her or forced her to leave without making noise. To test the first theory, they asked the family in detail whether Emily ever went for walks or left the house late at night. The answer was no. Emily was not the type to leave without telling anyone, especially that late. That pushed more weight onto the second theory. The possible presence of a stranger that night could be connected. Based on the statement about a figure behind the house, police started focusing on the possibility that someone approached the rear of the Harper house the night Emily disappeared. They noted that the back exit led directly into a dimly lit yard that was easy to reach from the small road behind the neighborhood. They also considered that an intruder might have been watching the area first. This information, combined with the basic timeline, helped police narrow the likely window when Emily left the house, an unobserved stretch from after her mother went to sleep until dawn. Police continued reviewing factors related to the disappearance, Emily's daily routine, usual habits, people she regularly contacted, but nothing indicated she had plans to leave or meet anyone that night. That made the timeline lean heavily toward something suspicious, more toward abduction or coercion than voluntary departure. Based on all the statements from friends, family, and neighbors, police concluded that Emily had made it home safely, stayed in her room, and vanished during an undetermined period after everyone else had gone to bed. From that foundation, Lewisburg police shifted focus to the area outside the Harper house immediately after completing initial documentation, looking for any signs of approach or movement from outside the night Emily disappeared. They started with the backyard, the area considered darkest and also where a witness had seen a strange figure the previous evening. The Harper backyard was fairly typical, a small patch of grass connected to the kitchen, then farther out an old wooden fence and a narrow path that ran along the edge of the property to a side road behind the neighborhood. The ground had a light dampness from the night fog, which could preserve traces, even if not clearly. On close inspection, police noted several spots where the ground was unusually compressed, as if something heavy or someone had recently stepped there. Among them were 2 faint shoe prints right next to the fence, toes pointing toward the yard, and they did not match the size of any shoes owned by the family. However, the prints weren't sharp enough to measure exact size or sole pattern. They marked the spots with colored pins and logged them because these were the first physical signs that someone may have stood or moved in the area the night of the disappearance. Also, a few steps from the fence, the ground showed light drag marks, but they weren't clear enough to say whether a person or object caused them. Police continued examining the fence around the backyard. One section of wood on the lower east side was bent slightly outward, as if force had been applied from outside. The family confirmed that section had been fined before. Although they couldn't confirm it as proof of entry, police logged the detail because it was in a spot that would make an easy approach from the rear road into the yard. They also surveyed the path that ran parallel to the fence. That path led to a fork into a thinly wooded area where streetlights didn't reach, making it an ideal spot for anyone wanting to approach the house unnoticed. On the path, police found an uneven patch of damp dirt that had been disturbed, possibly by a shoe stepping quickly. But because the ground was soft and covered with dry leaves, the mark didn't provide specific information. To organize the entire outdoor scene, police began making a detailed map of the area, marking every anomaly, the location of the 2 faint shoe prints, the bent fence section, the compressed dirt patches, and the path with signs of movement. They measured distances from the Harper back door to the fence, fence to the path, and path to the rear road to determine possible approach routes. This map became the first visual tool for analyzing whether someone had come from the rear the night Emily disappeared. When evaluating the likelihood of intrusion, police considered 3 factors: how dark the area was, how concealed the path was, and the distance from the path to the back door. The lack of lighting in the backyard meant an outsider could stand watch or move without being seen. The path was an easy access route without having to cross the main street. The Harper back door only had a standard lock, no extra security, making approach from that side more feasible than others. Based on these factors, police tentatively concluded that if someone did approach the Harper house that night, the rear was by far the most logical route. Still, what they could see on the ground remained too vague to confirm an actual intrusion. Therefore, immediately after completing the survey of the area surrounding the Harper home and finding no clear traces of the direction Emily's direction of movement, the Lewisburg force decided to launch the first large-scale search phase to sweep the entire surrounding vicinity. A mixed team was formed consisting of police officers, a K-9 unit, members from the local rescue force, and a group of volunteer residents in the town ready to assist. Forming the search team was prioritized and carried out the same day, with the goal of covering as quickly as possible the natural areas where the victim might have entered or been taken. After agreeing on the plan, the search team split into multiple smaller groups to sweep each zone in an expanding radius from the Harper home. Buffalo Valley was the closest natural area, and also the one with the most complex terrain, so the group with the K9 unit was assigned to enter this area first. Buffalo Valley consists of strips of sparse forest, low hills, and many small trails connecting residential areas to the town's main trail. The terrain characteristics make this place easy to hide in but difficult to search, requiring close coordination between humans and search dogs. The K9 search were given Emily's scent through her clothing. In the first few minutes, the dogs reacted, showing they recognized the scent and pulling the team toward the trail behind the Harper home. The group moved deeper into the sparse forest while other teams began searching along the banks of the Susquehanna River, where the terrain was more open but had thick bushes along the shore that could easily conceal objects or traces. The riverbank search team swept from the residential area outward to the wider branch of the river, scanning every water's edge and checking low bushes. Meanwhile, the volunteer groups lined up horizontally along the trails connecting the town, trying to observe everything from dropped items, fresh shoe prints, to any disturbance of the soil or dry leaves. Whenever they encountered a suspicious spot, they marked it with wooden stakes for the professional teams to check. At Buffalo Valley, the K9 unit continued leading the group deeper until the dogs suddenly lost the scent in a forested section farther back, where the terrain shifted to larger tree canopies that caused the wind to strongly disperse the scent. Although the K9 continued searching the surrounding area, the scent trail was no longer consistent, forcing the group to switch to a grid search tactic instead of direct tracking. This was the point that caused the search to take longer than expected because the area where the scent was lost was quite large and had many small branching paths. When the search teams regrouped to expand the radius, a group of volunteers on the eastern side of Buffalo Valley discovered a small object lying a few hundred meters from the Harper home. The object was near a trail that branched into the forest, partially covered by dry leaves and fallen branches. Although they could not immediately determine who it belonged to, the volunteer group immediately reported it to the officer in charge of the sector. Police arrived to examine it and recorded that the item matched the description of personal belongings Emily usually carried. The item was not in the area the family had already searched around the house, nor was it in an area local residents habitually passed through, so its presence was deemed unusual. Police marked the discovery location, photographed the scene, and sealed the item according to standard procedure. This was the first physical clue to appear since Emily went missing, providing a new focus for the search, although nothing could yet be confirmed about her condition or location. The discovery of the item in a natural area, not far from the home, also caused the search teams to adjust their scope and tactics, continuing to thoroughly sweep the area around this location with higher intensity while maintaining broad coverage so as not to miss any possibility related to Emily Harper's disappearance. After the item was found in the sparse forest area of Buffalo Valley, Lewisburg police immediately carried out the standard evidence collection procedure to preserve all future analytical possibilities. The small scene where the item was discovered was marked with colored stakes and photographed close-up, mid-range, and wide-angle to record its relative position to the trail and any disturbed soil patches around it. An evidence officer wearing fresh gloves used tweezers to place the item into a sealed evidence bag, clearly labeling the case number, date, and collection location before transporting it to the department's technical lab. Once the item reached the processing room, technicians began with oblique light surface examination to look for contact traces. With small evidence items recovered outdoors like this, the chances of recovering fingerprints were always low because the surface was usually covered with moisture, dirt, or fine sand that destroyed ridge detail. Nevertheless, per procedure, they still applied carbon and aluminum powder to detect any potential latent prints. After gently brushing powder over all graspable areas, the technician observed some powder adherents forming shapes, but the clarity was far too poor. The ridge lines were broken and insufficiently detailed for entry into the comparison system. They photographed these areas for the record, but noted in the internal report that the prints did not meet identification standards. The next step was basic material analysis of the item. The technician used an optical magnifier to examine fibers, surface coating, and manufacturing structure to determine material type. Results showed the item was made of common material that was widely available and had no distinctive features sufficient to suggest a specific distribution chain. They further noted the item had damp soil, leaf debris, and a few scratches from natural contact with the ground or branches. However, there were no signs it had been subjected to heavy impact or direct struggle. The technician then checked for possible biological sampling, swabbing the surface for skin cells, hair, or foreign fabric fibers. However, because the item had been exposed to the natural environment for an unknown period, most adhering material was soil, humus, plant fibers, and other forest contaminants. A few tiny fibers recovered were too degraded to determine origin. Under 1996 technology limitations, amplification of DNA from trace or degraded samples was impossible. Therefore, genetic testing was ruled infeasible, and efforts to identify who had touched or owned the item reached a dead end at this stage. After completing basic analysis steps, the technician prepared a summary report. No usable fingerprints recovered, no DNA obtainable, material lacked distinctive characteristics, and no evidence of abnormal impact beyond ordinary environmental exposure. The report was returned to the investigative team, emphasizing that the item's only value lay in its discovery location. Several hundred meters from the Harper home and near a little-used trail, rather than providing any identification information or specific guidance about Emily's movements the night she disappeared. The analysis showed this evidence was insufficient to open a clear investigative direction, but still had to be retained in the file because it was the first object found in a natural area, possibly linked to the disappearance, without a way to prove or rule out the connection. Lewisburg police, having obtained no useful information from the item found in the forest, shifted focus to expanding interviews with residents around the Harper home area to find any details that could fill gaps in Emily's timeline. They went house to house within several blocks, asking about any unusual movement the night of the incident, from strange noises to the appearance of strangers in the neighborhood. During this process, they began noticing a common thread in many statements. Most households mentioned the recent arrival of a new neighbor, Mark Elwood, who had rented a house behind the Harper residence shortly before Emily disappeared. Residents described Mark as reclusive, often going out in the evenings and sometimes walking the trails behind the houses at times when almost no one else in the area was outside. Some said they had seen him standing in his backyard for long periods on previous evenings, as if watching or relaxing, but since nothing had happened they hadn't paid close attention. When multiple independent statements mentioned the same person, police decided they needed to speak directly with Mark to verify his whereabouts and schedule the night Emily disappeared. They went to Mark's house that afternoon, and he agreed to talk, appearing cooperative but cautious. During the interview, Mark stated he was home most of the evening and only went for a short walk before going to bed. However, when asked for more detail about when he went out, which direction, and when he returned, Mark's answers became inconsistent. At first, he said he went out not long after dark, but when mentioned the time other houses saw Emily return home, Mark amended that he might have gone out later. When asked if he saw or heard anything unusual, Mark replied he didn't remember clearly, a response noted as more vague than normal in a missing person investigation. Additionally, Mark could not clearly state how long he was out, which direction he took on the back trail, or whether he encountered anyone else. His uncertainty about basic personal schedule questions raised a flag, especially since most other residents described the neighborhood as very quiet that night, with few people outside. Although there was still no direct evidence linking Mark to Emily's disappearance, his repeated appearance in multiple statements, combined with the inconsistencies in timing and movement direction, led police to place him on the persons of interest list for monitoring. They added to the file notes about the location of his house relative to the Harpers, the daily habits. multiple residents had described, and especially the fact he regularly used the back trails, the same area where search teams found the item believed to belong to Emily. Mark emerging as an intersection point in many neighbors' accounts was not enough to conclude anything, but it was sufficient for police to regard him as someone requiring closer scrutiny in a still clue-sparse investigation. As a result, their attention began shifting from broad hypotheses to more detailed examination of individuals present near the Harper home the night Emily disappeared, with Mark Elwood standing out most prominently in this expanded information-gathering phase. Immediately after completing the expanded interviews and recording considerable information surrounding Mark Elwood, but still lacking any element strong enough to take the next step, investigators began facing the reality that the investigation lacked clear physical foundation. One of the biggest difficulties was that the Harper home area and the entire surrounding block had no security camera systems whatsoever, a common situation in small towns in 1996. This left police with absolutely no visual data to determine whether anyone approached the Harper house that night or whether Emily left the house at some point while the family slept. The absence of cameras also meant they could not verify Mark's presence beyond his own vague statement, as there was no way to cross-check actual movement against any independent record. Concurrently, efforts to determine Emily's direction of departure continued to hit dead ends. All entry and exit points showed no clear signs of passage. The front door had not been opened. The back door showed no pry marks, and the backyard had only a few faint shoe prints that were insufficient to reconstruct a specific route. Search teams could not identify any starting or ending point indicating Emily had left the property on foot, and there were no clues suggesting she had been placed in a vehicle. This forced police to question whether she left the house without leaving traces, or whether the incident occurred within the property itself without anyone yet realizing it. When expanding the investigation to possible vehicle involvement, police also obtained no significant results. No one in the neighborhood reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles stopping or driving slowly that night. The surrounding roads, even when repatrolled for tire tracks or unusual ruts, showed no specific vehicle evidence from the relevant time. Combined with dry, cold weather and ground covered in fallen leaves, it was extremely difficult to preserve any identifiable tire marks. Meanwhile, re-examining the item found in Buffalo Valley yielded no new investigative leads. The lab report confirmed the evidence had no identification value, no usable DNA, and no recoverable fingerprints. This left the item serving only as a location marker, unable to confirm or refute whether it belonged to Emily or someone else. Search teams continued sweeping additional nearby areas, but no further physical evidence or signs appeared. Each expansion of the search area only increased the vagueness of the initial assumptions, because if Emily had left in any direction, there should have been at least some physical trace left behind, yet there was none. In that context, the case file began to stall noticeably. The information obtained from neighbors' statements, while helpful early on, was insufficient to generate a new breakthrough. Mark Elwood's repeated appearance and statements made him noteworthy, but there was no direct evidence proving he approached the Harper house the night of the incident. Even the faint backyard shoe prints and the slightly bent section of fence could not be traced to any specific individual. Every investigative step circled back to the starting point: no traces, no eyewitnesses, no recording devices. When investigators could not establish Emily's route of movement, could not identify any involved vehicle, obtained no new physical evidence, and could not solidify suspicion against anyone, the team had to acknowledge the case had entered a deadlock phase. Internal reports gradually shifted from pursuing a clear direction to describing the status as lacking basis for further expansion, reflecting the reality that the investigation had reached a dead end with no visible way to break through. After many months with no significant progress, Emily Harper's missing person file gradually shifted from active investigation to long-term storage, and in 1997, the Lewisburg Police Department officially transferred the entire case file to the Pennsylvania State Police Cold Case Unit. This was standard procedure for cases without new leads after a certain period, especially missing person cases lacking clear physical evidence and authenticated information for continued expansion. Emily's file was classified as unsolved insufficient evidence and placed on the list of cases to be reopened only upon new reported information or advancements in investigative technology. In the following years, almost no additional data was added. No new witnesses came forward, no new physical evidence was discovered, and no reports from surrounding areas showed any match to Emily's case. The prolonged silence made restarting the investigative thread increasingly difficult, as the officers originally involved were reassigned or retired over time. Case-related documents were stored scattered across multiple small files, interview transcripts, scene diagrams, technical reports on the found item, interview lists, patrol logs, and handwritten reminder notes from investigators, all mixed in storage boxes that only the original team would understand how to navigate. Under the storage protocol of that era, files were updated by appending new material to the end, causing the investigative timeline to become fragmented. This meant anyone reviewing the file in the future would have to spend considerable time reassembling the full sequence of events. Furthermore, the limited forensic tools of the 1990s rendered those original technical reports of little value by modern standards. With no viable DNA samples, no matching fingerprints, and no directional physical evidence, the file gradually entered a static state, regarded as a case unsolvable with then available technology. From 1997 to 2010, Emily's file was reopened only a handful of times, mainly to check for new reports from other agencies. Each time the result was the same: no additional information, no new events to compare, no match any open case at the time. The file continued to sit in cold storage, becoming one of hundreds of unsolved missing person cases in Pennsylvania for more than a decade. From 2001 to 2007, while Emily Harper's file remained in cold storage with no new information added, the Pennsylvania State Police began recording a series of additional disappearances in towns across the same central region of the state, including Danville, Williamsport, and Selinsgrove. These cases were initially treated as isolated incidents because each occurred at different times, separated by several years, and fell under the jurisdiction of different counties. However, when placed side by side in chronological order, they started to reveal certain similarities that were difficult to ignore. Although at the time there was not enough data to link them into a single behavioral pattern or recognize them as a repeating series. The first in this sequence was recorded in Danville in 2001. The victim was a 21-year-old woman who lived with a roommate. She was last seen returning to her apartment after finishing a late shift at a local restaurant. Her roommate stated that she went to bed early and heard no sound of anyone leaving during the night. The next morning, the door was still locked. There were no signs of forced entry, but the young woman was not in the apartment and could not be reached. Just as in Emily Harper's earlier case, all of the victim's essential belongings remained behind, and there was no indication that she had left voluntarily or prepared to leave the home. Searches were conducted along nearby trails and residential areas, but yielded no results, and the case quickly fell into the same dead-end category as many other disappearances in the region. 3 years later, in 2004, a similar case was recorded in Williamsport. This time, the victim was a 17-year-old girl who lived with her family. She vanished during the night without making any noise. No one in the household heard the door open, and there was no evidence she had left willingly. One family member reported thinking they heard a faint sound in the backyard, but did not check, assuming it was wildlife common to the area. When the disappearance was reported the next morning, police searched the backyard and the adjacent secondary road behind the house, but they found only unexplained disturbed soil, similar to the pattern seen in Emily's case years earlier. No items were recovered, there were no direct witnesses, and the lack of evidence forced the case into the unsolved category, even though the initial search had been conducted quickly and thoroughly. By 2007, a third disappearance occurred in Lewisburg, further reinforcing the emerging common pattern among the cases, yet still not enough for police to formulate a linking theory. This victim was a 24-year-old woman who rented a house near the edge of town. She was last seen entering her home after meeting friends. A neighbor at the rear of the property reported seeing the lights in the victim's house turn off earlier than usual, but heard no door opening or closing and no unusual sounds. The following morning, the back door was found slightly ajar, but there were no signs of forced entry, nothing inside the home had been disturbed, and both the victim and all her personal belongings had vanished without a trace. Police searched surrounding vacant lots and town-edge trails, but found nothing. The fact that 3 disappearances had now occurred within a relatively close geographic area led a few investigators to question whether this was an unusual coincidence or whether some common factor was operating behind the scenes. However, at that time there was no forensic analysis technology powerful enough to compare subtle traces such as faint shoe prints, soil samples, or behavioral data. No witnesses provided consistent information about strangers in the victim's areas around the time of the incidents. Additionally, each case fell under the jurisdiction of a different county agency, so information sharing was not always synchronized. Each agency handled its own case within its authority, and because none had strong leads or clear physical evidence, they were treated as separate events with no statewide linking alerts triggered. Emily Harper's file at that point remained in the cold case unit but showed no direct matches with the 3 newer victims due to the lack of comparable evidence. No DNA profiles, no fingerprints, no security camera footage, and physical traces such as shoe patterns or soil were too faint and lacked legal weight. The disappearances were spaced years apart, with individual variables in location and circumstances, so they could not be grouped together under any technical criteria available at the time. From an investigative standpoint, contextual similarities were not strong enough to overcome the absence of direct evidence. For these reasons, throughout the 2001-2007 period, all 3 new disappearances were simply recorded as isolated incidents, each quickly reaching the same investigative impasse as Emily Harper's earlier case, with no mechanism or information yet available to reveal the potential connections between them. By 2010, while the files for the Danville, Williamsport, Selinsgrove, and Emily Harper disappearances remained scattered across various police departments' cold storage cabinets with no basis for linking them. A new incident in the suburbs, near Mifflinburg, forced Pennsylvania State Police investigators to pay special attention. This was the first case in nearly 2 decades in which a victim could directly describe what had happened to her. The victim was a 26-year-old woman who lived alone in a second-floor apartment in a small rental complex on the edge of the road connecting the town to sparsely populated areas to the north. That evening, after work, she stopped at a convenience store, bought a few items, and drove home. As she got out of her car and had taken only a few steps, a man suddenly rushed from the side of the parking lot, grabbed her arm, and tried to drag her toward a gray sedan parked right next to the fence. Caught off guard, she lost her balance and was half pulled inside the car before she could react. The man used strong force to pin her down onto the passenger seat, one hand over her mouth, the other gripping her shoulder tightly and slamming the door shut. The victim stated that in that moment she could barely see the attacker's face because of the darkness and the speed of the assault. But she clearly remembered the sensation of being forced down into the seat while the man's hand clamped under her jaw, forcing her head to turn away. As she was pinned, she noticed the smell of old plastic and a faint odor of sweat coming from the attacker's jacket. What allowed her to escape was not immediate resistance, but the attacker's momentary hesitation when she drove her knee hard into his lower abdomen, causing him to loosen his grip for an instant. Seizing the opportunity, she pushed hard against the door panel and wriggled out of the seat. The attacker made one last grab at her jacket, but only managed to tear a section near the shoulder before letting go and fleeing around the back of the car when he heard voices of people from the neighboring building calling to each other. The victim ran inside in panic and called 911 immediately. When police arrived, she was still in shock but lucid enough to describe the sequence of events. According to her account, the car was an older model gray sedan with a quiet door-closing sound. The passenger seat felt worn and slightly sagging at the backrest. The attacker was described as a light-skinned male of average build with very strong arms. And most importantly, in the victim's estimation, he appeared to be left-handed because his left hand was the one he used to cover her mouth and press her cheek down, while his right hand held her shoulder with noticeably less force. This detail was noted immediately by police because it could help narrow the suspect pool. When technicians examined the victim's torn jacket, they discovered numerous tiny fibers clinging to the shoulder and collar area. Fibers that did not come from her own jacket but appeared to be automotive upholstery fibers. These fibers were grayish-brown, of uneven length, and had a coarse texture consistent with the fabric seats commonly found in 1990s sedans. Police collected every adhering fiber, sealed them in separate evidence bags, and sent them for immediate testing to determine material composition and origin. Because forensic technology in 2010 had advanced significantly since 1996, the lab could now analyze fibers at a much higher level of detail, including microscopic structure and basic chemical composition. However, even with the improved capabilities, the conclusion at the time was limited. The fibers were automotive upholstery fabric of a type common in many mainstream vehicles, with no unique characteristics that would allow precise sourcing. What did stand out to investigators was that this fabric type had not been widely used in vehicles manufactured after 2000, strongly suggesting the attacker was driving an older sedan from the late 1990s or the 1995-1999 range. Though not enough to identify the exact car, it provided a vehicle class to focus on. Police continued interviewing the victim once she had calmed down, trying to extract any additional description of the attacker. She reiterated that his left hand was far stronger and that she remembered being pulled sideways to the left when he yanked her into the car, a common indicator of a left-handed person exerting force. She also recalled the attacker's voice only briefly, more as heavy breathing than distinct words, which did not help identification but was recorded for the file. The parking lot was thoroughly examined. Police used angled lighting to search for drag marks or shoe prints, but because the surface was asphalt and lighting was poor, virtually no traces remained. They noted only a faint elongated smudge near the fence that might have been a shoe print but lacked enough edge detail for sampling. Nearby, a small amount of soil that may have fallen from the attacker's shoe during the struggle was recovered, but the quantity was too small for comparison with any database. Nevertheless, all samples were collected and preserved in case future technology could extract more information. The 2010 incident report was regarded as one of the rare cases in the region in which a victim escaped a situation that could have led to disappearance, and it was entered into long-term tracking files under the label attempted abduction. The structure of the event: a young woman attacked near her home, pulled toward a gray sedan, attacker dominant with his left hand, and a scene with no clear physical evidence, was preserved as a special case because it provided far more data than the previous no-witness disappearances. Although police had no specific suspect at the time, they retained all recovered fibers as evidence that might prove valuable later, marking them as part of an open file for future comparison should similar incidents arise in the area. In 2012, after the 2010 attempted abduction file had been added and began serving as a new reference point in the region, the Pennsylvania State Police undertook a restructuring of numerous long-dormant cold cases to screen for repeating patterns that had previously lacked sufficient basis for recognition. A newly assigned cold case unit detective, Lieutenant Ryan Holcomb, began re-examining the entire 1996 Emily Harper disappearance file as a priority because its timing coincided with the period when many other unsolved disappearances had been recorded in central Pennsylvania. Upon receiving the file, Holcomb spent days simply organizing the scattered documents cataloged using old methods into a coherent timeline. He reviewed every witness statement, every technical report, every scene diagram, and every stored piece of evidence. In the process, he paid particular attention to three categories of information that the original investigation could not fully exploit due to 1996 technological and investigative limitations. The items recovered in the woods near Buffalo Valley, the faint shoe prints in the Harper backyard, and the inconsistent statements of Mark Elwood. Holcomb re-examined the recovered items first. The 1996 report clearly stated that no usable fingerprints were obtained, no DNA analysis was possible, and the items were classified as common. But with modern forensic knowledge, Holcomb noted that even tiny adhering fibers or particles on the items could now yield useful information if reanalyzed with current technology. He filed a request to send the items to the state's new laboratory for re-evaluation. Regarding the faint backyard shoe prints, Holcomb located the original scene photographs and observed that although the prints were unclear, the sole pattern contained several short, broken straight segments, something that might match certain older shoe models but could not be confirmed by eye. He proposed feeding the images into trace analysis software to see whether any additional data could be extracted. While he could not guarantee modern technology would clarify the prints, Holcomb considered this a necessary step in reviving the case. When reviewing Mark Elwood's statements, Holcomb focused on the inconsistencies in timing and movement on the night Emily disappeared. The original report noted that Mark could not specify when he left the house, could not describe his walking route, and did not recall encountering anyone or hearing unusual sounds. What caught Holcomb's attention most, however, was a small note from the original investigator. Mark Elwood often walked the trail behind the Harper house in the evenings. When Holcomb placed this detail alongside the location where the items were found in the woods, several hundred meters from the Harper house, directly on a branch of that same trail, it became something worth re-examining, even though no direct conclusion could yet be drawn. The turning point in re-evaluating the file came when Holcomb compared the 1996 case to the 2010 attack. One disappearance with no trace from inside the home. One failed abduction that occurred the moment the victim was about to enter her own door. An attacker who used strong force, was left-hand dominant, and left behind old car seat upholstery fibers. Holcomb noted that although the cases were 14 years apart, they shared three core elements: young female victims approached at or very near their homes, and no clear physical evidence left behind. Furthermore, the 2010 fibers were grayish-brown and from an older seat type, prompting Holcomb to wonder whether the 1996 perpetrator might have used a similar vehicle to approach Emily. The original 1996 investigation had found no vehicle traces, but Holcomb recognized this as a point to revisit from a new perspective because the 2010 attacker's behavior, rapid approach, pulling the victim into a car, then fleeing before detection, could fit the pattern seen in many of the area's unsolved disappearances. While reprocessing the entire file, Holcomb decided to open formal requests for renewed forensic analysis with three specific goals. Re-examine the items found in the woods using modern fiber and DNA technology. Run the shoe print photographs through trace reconstruction software for possible comparison with newer data. And test the soil samples collected from the Harper backyard for mineral characteristics that might allow future geographic comparison within the region. Holcomb also compiled a list of information needing verification, including Mark Elwood's residential history from 1996 to 2010, the types of vehicles he had owned or used, and any area reports mentioning older gray sedans. He noted that reopening the case should proceed along parallel tracks, reanalysis of old scene evidence, and cross-referencing with the 2010 incident to determine whether any intersection existed in behavior, tools, or approach pattern. Although no direct evidence yet existed, Holcomb believed that viewing the 1996 case in a broader context could open a new investigative path. The one thing he was certain of at that moment was that Emily Harper's file could no longer be treated as an isolated disappearance, especially as patterns across the region over more than a decade were beginning to reveal similarities that no one previously had the opportunity to connect. From 2013 to 2015, after Lieutenant Ryan Holcomb determined that the evidence seized in the 1996 disappearance of Emily Harper might yield new value if analyzed with modern technology, the Cold Case Unit initiated a forensic re-examination process using next-generation equipment. The first step was to reanalyze the fibers recovered from items found at Buffalo Valley. The samples were examined under a scanning electron microscope, CM combined with energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, EDX, a technology that was not available in 1996 for thin, damaged, or naturally contaminated fiber samples. The SEM results provided far more detailed surface images of the fibers than the previous optical photographs, making it possible to identify the twist structure and wear patterns. Under EDX, the chemical composition revealed a polyester nylon blend base with a characteristic ratio used in older automobile seat upholstery, particularly in mainstream American sedans, manufactured roughly between 1998. When cross-referenced with the State Lab's Vehicle Upholstery Materials Library, technicians concluded that the fiber had a high probability of originating from the fabric seats of domestic U.S. sedans from that period, rather than from common clothing or household furniture materials. This represented a major breakthrough because it placed the items found in the woods in 1996 in the same material category as the upholstery fibers recovered in the attempted abduction in 2010. Although it could not be proven that the two samples came from the exact same vehicle, the fact that cases 14 years apart both involved identical seat fabric types from the same vehicle segment led Holcomb to note that this was a coincidence worthy of deeper analysis. While the fiber team worked, another forensic group processed the soil sample collected from the Harper family's backyard in 1996. Previously recorded only as disturbed soil, unknown origin, the sample could now, with modern mineral analysis technology, be broken down into micro-mineral layers and have its ratios of clay ore, silica particles, and region-specific minerals precisely identified. Analysis revealed the presence of a rare mineral group, including low levels of serpentine and chrysotile, asbestos-like minerals not naturally common in residential Lewisburg soil, but frequently found near construction sites or areas with past utility trenching. Holcomb compared this data to the town's geological maps and discovered that similar mineral compositions appeared in an area just a few miles away, where an HVAC installation project had been carried out by a small contractor in the mid-1990s. When he requested local records, Holcomb found one striking detail: Mark Elwood had worked as a temporary HVAC technician for that company in 1996, the period immediately preceding Emily's disappearance. HVAC work routinely involves contact with piping, insulation materials, and excavated foundation areas where such minerals easily adhere to boots or clothing. Although the soil sample was not sufficient to prove Mark was definitely in the Harper backyard on the night Emily vanished, the mineral match between the sample and the area where Mark had worked led Holcomb to note in his report that this was a noteworthy compatible forensic factor that warranted further consideration in the overall evidence evaluation. As part of the new technology review, the forensic team also re-examined the faint footwear impressions photographed in 1996. Using modern image reconstruction software, technicians were able to remove noise layers, enhance contrast, and reconstruct basic sole edge outlines. The results showed a men's athletic-style sole average size with a short, segmented rectangular block tread pattern, a common design but one that matched the style widely sold during the 1990s. This was not specific enough to identify the shoe brand or model, yet it aligned with descriptions given by several neighbors in 1996 of the footwear Mark Elwood was seen wearing. Although it could not be treated as direct evidence, Holcomb regarded this compatibility as another small piece in the emerging overall picture. Between 2014 and 2015, Holcomb and the forensic team created a comparative matrix covering the 1996 case, the 3 2001, 2007 disappearances, and the 2010 attempted abduction, focusing on identifiable forensic elements, victim approach characteristics, attack locations, fiber types recovered, likely use of an older sedan, similar tread pattern impressions, and repeating soil sample results. Using these data points, the cold case unit began building a potential suspect profile through forensic intersection analysis, assigning weights to each factor. The result yielded two main suspect pools: individuals with access to older vehicles and individuals with a history of activity in the Lewisburg, Danville, Mifflinburg area between 1996 and 2010. When both criteria were applied, only a small subset remained in the overlap zone, and within that list the most prominent name was Mark Elwood, the man who had lived next door to the Harpers, who had appeared in multiple neighbor statements in 1996, who had worked HVAC in the soil match area, and whose movements between towns coincided with the timeline of the later disappearances. Holcomb did not treat this as a conclusion, but he considered it strong enough grounds to formally designate Mark Elwood as the primary forensic suspect for the first time in nearly 2 decades since the case was first reported. Once the suspect profile was established on the new forensic data, Lieutenant Ryan Holcomb expanded the investigation by tracing Mark Elwood's complete movement history, residences, and employment records from 1996 through 2010 to determine whether his presence intersected with the disappearances in the region. This required gathering housing records, tax documents, rental receipts, employment files, and even multi-year vehicle registrations, since Mark had held seasonal jobs, changed addresses frequently, and moved between towns without leaving a clear trail. Holcomb started with 1996, the year Emily Harper vanished. Records showed Mark had rented a small house directly behind the Harper residence approximately 6 months before the incident. He worked part-time for a local HVAC company and regularly traveled through the Buffalo Valley area, the same location where items were recovered during the search for Emily. According to 1996 neighbor interview transcripts, Mark was described as someone who often walked in the evening along the trail behind the Harper house, sometimes disappearing into the tree lines along Buffalo Valley and reappearing near home at odd hours. A few weeks after Emily's disappearance, Mark moved out of the rental without telling anyone in the neighborhood, leaving the impression that sudden moves were part of his pattern. Records next placed Mark in Danville by late 1997. Danville was the site of the 2001 disappearance. The first in the trio the cold case unit was re-examining, checking 2001 residency addresses. Holcomb discovered Mark lived only about 1 block from the first victim's apartment, in an area with a secluded pedestrian path connecting his rental complex to the victim's building. Although no direct evidence placed Mark at the scene that night, Holcomb flagged the geographic coincidence as highest priority in his timeline comparison. Employment records further revealed that Mark quit his job 3 days after the 2001 disappearance, citing health reasons with no supporting documentation. Moving to 2004 data, the year of the second disappearance in Williamsport, Holcomb found, through tax and rental records, that Mark had moved to Williamsport in early 2003 and worked at a refrigeration repair shop just a few blocks from the Williamsport victim's home. From March to August 2004, Mark had irregular work hours and frequently left early without clear explanation. Personnel notes described him as quiet, often eating lunch alone, and driving an older gray sedan to work every day. This detail caught Holcomb's attention because a gray sedan matched the description from the 2010 attempted abduction, and the forensic team had already linked the 1996 fibers to seat fabric typical of 1994. 1998 vehicles, the same era as the car co-workers, recalled Mark driving in 2004. Further review of Mark's 2004 movements revealed a parking ticket issued for illegal parking near the victim's neighborhood the week before she vanished. While the ticket itself was not incriminating, it confirmed Mark's presence in the area close to the critical time. In 2007, the third disappearance occurred in Selinsgrove. Checking Snyder County rental records, Holcomb found Mark had registered a room at a low-cost motel in Selinsgrove from late 2006 through mid-2007. The address sat on the main road leading to the victim's neighborhood, roughly 1 mile from the scene. Mark's bank records from that period showed a fuel purchase at a gas station a few hundred yards from the victim's home on the exact day the disappearance was reported. Although the station had no cameras, the transaction timestamp placed Mark in the area at a critical moment. These intersections convinced Holcomb that Mark's movements formed a pattern rather than random coincidence. In particular, when examining the nearly 15-year timeline, Holcomb observed that every time a disappearance occurred, Mark Elwood either lived or worked within a few miles of the scene. The 2001 Danville, 2004 Williamsport, and 2007 Selinsgrove cases were all within easy driving or walking distance of Mark's known addresses or workplaces. After analyzing the 3 disappearances, Holcomb returned to the 2010 attempted abduction. Tax and driver's license data showed Mark had moved to the Mifflinburg suburbs in late 2009, living within 1 mile of the attack location. Vehicle registration records for that year confirmed he still owned a 1998 gray sedan. The first time a specific vehicle could be directly tied to the survivor's description of the perpetrator's car. Additionally, Mark's 2010 medical records showed treatment for a minor injury to his left hand shortly after the attempted abduction, which he attributed to a work accident. Combined with the survivor's statement that the attacker was left-handed, Holcomb flagged this as a significant intersection between the perpetrator description and Mark's actual characteristics. When Holcomb plotted every residency, employment, and movement data point from 1996 to 2010 onto a single chart, a clear pattern emerged. Mark Elwood moved in phases tied to jobs, and each phase coincided in both time and location with a new disappearance or attack. Behind the Harpers, 2001 lived 1 block from the Danville victim. 2004 worked a few blocks from the Williamsport victim. 2007 rented a room roughly 1 mile from the Selinsgrove victim. 2010 resided 1 mile from the Mifflinburg attack parking lot. Each location was easily accessible. And in every case the method of victim approach was similar: contact in darkness near the victim's home, no clear traces left, and the victim either vanished or was nearly subdued without significant noise. Mark's constant relocations, job changes, and lack of long-term ties to any single place had previously made the pattern difficult to detect. But by compiling 14 years of data into one system, Holcomb saw that the repetition was too consistent to be random. Although still short of conclusive proof, Mark Elwood's timeline made him the only individual who appeared near every scene, and his movement pattern aligned strikingly with the chronology of the crimes. In 2014, while Lieutenant Ryan Holcomb was in the process of synthesizing the data points related to Mark Elwood's travels to strengthen the forensic and behavioral model, an unexpected new source emerged from an old friend of Mark's, whom Holcomb located only after reviewing long-dormant contact lists from Mark's 1997-1998 employment files. When asked about Mark's personality and habits during the years they hung out, the witness provided one detail that immediately stood out to Holcomb. He recalled Mark once saying, in a vague conversation, "Sometimes people just disappear and nobody ever knows why," followed by a half smile as if hiding something. The friend added that on one occasion during a small gathering, Mark became visibly irritated when a group of women walked past and muttered, "Some people shouldn't be out wandering alone." At the time it was dismissed as rudeness or a bad mood, but in the context of the disappearances Holcomb was reviewing, the witness now felt the remark could carry darker meaning. Holcomb immediately logged the statement as behavioral data because it showed Mark had alluded to the concept of disappearance in an inappropriate way, and in behavioral investigation, such statements often reflect a person's thinking or fantasies. After this initial statement opened a new avenue, Holcomb continued searching for additional witnesses who had known Mark across different periods, especially in Danville, Williamsport, and the Selinsgrove area, the locations of the respective disappearances. During the search, another witness who had lived in the same apartment complex as Mark in Williamsport from 2003-2004 described Mark habitually appearing in residential areas at night for no apparent reason. The witness said he sometimes saw Mark walking very slowly along darkened walkways or standing in front of other people's ground floor windows, staring inside as if watching someone. When asked why he never reported it, the witness explained that Mark was simply viewed as an eccentric loner and the complex was used to residents with odd hours. What particularly interested Holcomb, however, was that the witness once saw Mark following a young woman from the parking lot back to the building, staying dozens of yards behind but never taking his eyes off her. When the witness called out to ask what he was doing, Mark, startled, became irritated, gave a vague answer about checking the way, and left in another direction. Holcomb placed this testimony in the behavioral marker category because the description matched a classic stalking pattern: following at a distance, observing routines, staying nearby but avoiding contact, a trait commonly seen in attacks on young women. When Holcomb interviewed former co-workers from Mark's 2006-2007 Selinsgrove period, one store employee recalled that after shifts, Mark would often sit in his car for hours in the back parking lot without turning on the lights, just watching the main road where residents walked in the evenings. The co-worker felt Mark was always watching someone because his gaze, when young women passed, was unusually intense and prolonged. Another witness who worked on an upper floor of a building near Mark's residence described seeing Mark standing at the end of the hallway, staring out at the parking lot near midnight, for no reason. Individually, these statements were not enough to prove criminal behavior, but placed within Mark's overall timeline, they formed a clear behavioral pattern. Mark habitually watched women in familiar settings, frequently appeared near the homes or regular paths of young women, and often observed them from a distance for extended periods. Holcomb also located a previously overlooked 2001 statement from the Danville case file, in which a resident reported a strange man regularly leaning against a gray car on the path behind the complex, looking toward the missing victim's apartment. No one at the time identified the man, but the description of build, posture, and vehicle closely matched Mark Elwood in that period. The fact that multiple witnesses across 1996-2010 described Mark engaging in observation following or unusual lingering near women strengthened Holcomb's conclusion that these behavioral data points fit the profile of an individual who stalked for years before escalating to more serious acts. While not every stalker commits violent crime, in a series of traceless disappearances, plus one attempted abduction involving strong force, a left-handed attacker, and a gray sedan, the presence of a documented long-term stalking pattern dramatically increased the fit between the forensic and behavioral evidence. To solidify the analytical framework, Holcomb compiled every newly collected statement into Mark Elwood's surveillance file, assigning weights to behavioral factors such as following women at night, appearing near victims' residences, sitting and watching from his car, making remarks implying people disappeared, and reacting abnormally when questioned about being in inappropriate locations. When these were integrated into the forensic model, Holcomb noted that the behavioral elements aligned significantly with the victim approach patterns seen across multiple cases and could be regarded as a powerful chain of supporting indicators that Mark was present near the scenes at critical times. From 2014 to 2015, after gathering new statements from Mark Elwood's old friends along with multiple witnesses describing his habit of stalking women across different periods and locations, Lieutenant Ryan Holcomb took the single most important step in the entire investigation. He conducted a full cross-case analysis of the entire chain of cases from 1996 to 2010, using the cross-case analysis method in order to uncover hidden connections between the disappearances and the one survivor case that earlier forensic technology or traditional investigative methods had been unable to reveal. To do this, Holcomb collected every file from the 4 local police departments that corresponded to each incident in the chain: Lewisburg 1996, Danville 2001, Williamsport 2004, Selinsgrove 2007, and Mifflinburg 2010. First, he built a timeline chart showing the exact date and time of each incident, including the factors: the last known location of the victim, the type of environment, lighting conditions, possible approach vectors, and the time window in which the victim lost contact. When he placed all 5 events on the same timeline spanning nearly 15 years, Holcomb immediately saw that the spacing between incidents was not random. They clustered during periods when Mark Elwood had changed residences or jobs. Holcomb created a detailed geographic map plotting each incident by coordinates: the distance between each victim's home and where Mark was living at the time, the presence of trails or low-traffic backroads, the reasonable walking or driving radius of one individual, and quick-access traffic routes that would allow someone to reach the scene and leave without drawing attention. When these data layers were overlaid, Holcomb saw a pattern that could not be ignored. Every disappearance occurred within a tight radius of wherever Mark had lived or worked at the time. In some cases, Mark had even been just a few hundred yards from the scene. This led to the next layer of analysis, comparing the behavior described in each case. Holcomb pulled witness statements, suspicious behavior reports, victim routines, time of disappearance, and the degree of disturbance inside the homes. Every case pointed to the same approach pattern: the victim vanished in a very short window while close to her own home. No signs of a struggle, no loud noises, and no clear signs of forced entry or break-in. Using this analysis, Holcomb built a composite behavioral diagram in which each case was placed on a branch representing related factors: approach from behind, use of darkness or cover, rapid approach, control of the victim without noise, and leaving the scene with minimal trace evidence. When this pattern was compared to witness descriptions of Mark's behavior across multiple periods, Holcomb found striking consistency. Mark frequently appeared in the dark, followed women from behind, stared from a distance but maintained prolonged eye contact, sat in his car for hours in positions with good sightlines to women who lived alone, and was often present in the area at times when no one else noticed. The next critical detail was the left-handedness of the attacker in the 2010 survivor case. The victim described the attacker using his left hand to forcefully grip her jaw and shoulder, while his right hand held less firmly and appeared weaker. Holcomb checked medical records and discovered that Mark had suffered an injury to his left hand shortly before the 2010 attack, but the injury report also noted that Mark's left side was significantly more developed than his right, a classic indicator of a left-handed person. He added this data to the forensic linkage diagram, combining it with the results of the car seat fiber analysis from the 1996 evidence and the 2010 attack, plus multiple descriptions of the old gray sedan Mark had owned. When the forensic data was placed alongside the behavioral data and the geographic, temporal data, Holcomb built a network-style linkage map in which each disappearance was a node, and every forensic or behavioral element was a connecting line. When the map was complete, one thing was unmistakable: Mark Elwood was the sole common intersection across all 5 cases. No other individual had ever been near the homes of all 5 victims, no one else worked or lived on a cycle that matched the timing of each incident, and no one else had a vehicle description that matched both cases where a gray sedan was mentioned. Holcomb then tested exclusionary factors to ensure no other person was wrongly implicated. He reviewed lists of registered sex offenders in the area, lists of individuals reported for stalking women, vehicle registration movement data, and residency records from 1996 to 2010. The results showed that no one else was present at the right time and place across multiple incidents the way Mark was. One person in Danville in 2001 never appeared in Williamsport in 2004. Another who had been questioned in Williamsport in 2004 did not live in Selinsgrove in 2007, and none of them lived or worked near the parking lot where the 2010 attack occurred. Only Mark moved in a straight-line pattern, appearing in the right place at the right time before or during each incident, then leaving the area shortly afterward. When all the forensic files were placed on a comparison chart, Holcomb observed that the fiber similarities, soil mineral characteristics, victim approach behavior descriptions, and Mark's movement patterns all converged dramatically. In particular, the 1996 soil sample matched the area where Mark had worked as an HVAC technician, combined with felt fibers from the seat group used in cars Mark owned. And the left-handed detail that matched the 2010 attacker's description created a forensic structure that could not be considered coincidental. In the final stage of the cross-case analysis, Holcomb created a weighted scoring table for each factor: geographic match, temporal match, stalking behavior, fiber forensics, soil forensics, vehicle description, handedness characteristic, and continuous movement pattern across locations. When totaled, Mark's score far exceeded that of any other individual ever mentioned in any of the files. For the first time since Emily Harper disappeared in 1996, all the data from 5 separate cases over nearly 15 years pointed to the same conclusion: Mark Elwood was the sole common point linking the disappearances and the survivor case, the single thread connecting an entire chain of events that had previously been treated as unrelated. Thanks to the cross-case analysis, Holcomb established that these cases could no longer be viewed as isolated incidents, but were parts of one interconnected structure with only one person at its center. By 2018, almost 3 years after Lieutenant Ryan Holcomb completed the full cross-case analysis and identified Mark Elwood as the sole common intersection among the 1996, 2007 disappearances and the 2010 survivor case, the Pennsylvania State Police decided to submit every physical evidence item from all 5 cases to the newly rolled-out next-generation forensic analysis program, which included nanotrace fiber analysis, a technology capable of analyzing fibers at the nanoscale to determine material origin with unprecedented accuracy. This was the first time the felt fibers recovered from the 1996 evidence, the fibers stuck to the 2010 survivors' clothing, and the scattered fibers from the Danville, Williamsport, and Selinsgrove cases were all submitted together for comprehensive analysis. Previously, each fiber sample had only been examined individually using SEM/EDX, which was sufficient to identify the general material group, but not enough to conclude they came from the same seat or the same source. Nanotrace fiber analysis breaks fibers down into ultra-small segments, measures spectral characteristics, electron scattering, and fingerprints the polymer structure pattern in ways older technologies could not. When every fiber sample was run through this process, the results left both the forensic team and Holcomb in no doubt that they had reached a turning point. Every felt fiber recovered from all 5 incidents matched perfectly in polymer structure, nanofiber diameter, impurity density, surface degradation ratio, and oxidation characteristics, proving they originated from the exact same type of car seat, the same production batch, and very likely the same manufacturing lot of domestic U.S. sedan gray felt upholstery produced between 1994 and 1998. This meant the perpetrator in all 5 cases very likely used the same vehicle, or at minimum, all were linked to a sedan with seats from this exact material group. This level of match could not be considered random, because the material in all 5 cases was not just the same type, but had a polymer fingerprint so identical that it could only occur if the fibers came from one specific vehicle or one single source. Holcomb immediately cross-referenced Mark Elwood's vehicle records in 1996. Mark owned a 1995 gray sedan. In 2001, while living in Danville, he was still registered as driving that same car. In 2004, coworkers in Williamsport confirmed he drove an old gray sedan to work every day. In 2007, his Selinsgrove landlord described Mark regularly parking the gray car in front of the building. And in 2010, vehicle records show Mark owned a 1998 gray sedan that directly replaced the previous one. Both model lines used the exact seat felt confirmed by nanotrace fiber analysis. With these results, Holcomb added to the forensic report that not only did the fibers from the 1996 and 2010 cases match the same group, but all 5 fiber samples from the 5 incidents matched to a degree that created a unified forensic chain with a high probability of being linked to a single vehicle owned or used by Mark Elwood from 1996 through 2010. Parallel to the fiber re-examination, Holcomb ordered the soil samples retested using the newest mineral analysis technology combined with AI-driven soil layer profiling to match against current geological data. During this same period, Mark Elwood had been pulled over by a traffic officer in late 2017 for a broken taillight. And during the stop, a small amount of soil accidentally transferred onto Mark's shoes. That soil was collected as standard procedure and stored in the forensic system, but at the time it had not been compared to any older evidence. When Holcomb reviewed Mark's soil sample, he added it to the new analysis list. The nanomineral layering results showed that the 1996 soil sample from the Harper backyard had a mineral fingerprint virtually identical to the soil on Mark's shoes. In 2017, especially the presence of serpentine and chrysotile in a ratio rarely found in Lewisburg residential areas, but perfectly matching the mineral profile of the site where Mark had worked HVAC in 1995-1996. A location where, according to forensic records, the soil contained rare mineral characteristics found near deep excavation for pipe installation. Most strikingly, the chrysotile ratio in the 1996 sample was an exact match to the soil on Mark's shoes. Same mineral fracture color, same weathering level, same fibrous crystal form, and identical trace oxide content. These data led the forensic team to conclude that the 2017 soil sample not only shared geographic origin, but matched mineral grade layering pattern and abrasive particle signature with the 1996 sample. A conclusion only possible if Mark had stepped in soil with the exact characteristics of the Harper backyard area at the same time the 1996 sample was formed. When the software compared the 1996 soil fingerprint with the 2017 fingerprint, it returned a match with extremely high probability, well above the threshold for a scientific conclusion of physical presence at the scene. This meant the soil stuck to Mark's shoes carried the mineral signature of the exact spot behind the Harper house at the time Emily disappeared, and no other natural location within a 50-mile radius had a comparable fingerprint. When the results were presented, Holcomb understood they had entered a phase where forensics no longer merely suggested, it provided direct scientific proof of Mark's presence at a critical location at a critical time. Combining the 2018 nanotrace fiber analysis and soil matching results, Holcomb produced a comprehensive forensic report with 3 main conclusions. 1. The fiber samples from all 5 incidents matched perfectly and corresponded to the 1994, 1998 sedan seat upholstery group vehicles Mark continuously used from 1996 to 2010. 2. The soil sample on Mark's shoes in 2017 matched exactly the soil sample collected from behind the Harper house in 1996, proving Mark had been physically present in that location. 3. The forensic match between fibers and soil, when combined with behavioral data and movement data, established that Mark was present at the scene on the night Emily Harper disappeared. These conclusions were no longer in the realm of possible partial match or noteworthy observation. They became an independent, powerful, and irrefutable forensic foundation that, for the first time in over 2 decades, pushed the investigation to a decisive turning point. After the 2018 forensic conclusions confirmed that Mark Elwood was present at the scene the night Emily Harper disappeared, and the entire chain of fiber, soil, vehicle evidence all pointed in only one direction, toward Mark. The Pennsylvania State Police, PSP, moved to the next phase, covert surveillance, to assess Mark's current behavior and build the strongest possible arrest file. Given the severity of a case series spanning more than 2 decades and Mark's wide range of movement, PSP contacted the FBI for technical assistance in surveillance, behavioral analysis, and remote data collection. For weeks, a joint PSP-FBI team secretly followed Mark at his residence, workplace, and the areas he frequented at unusual hours. The surveillance team never made direct contact. They relied on long-range observation and recorded his daily routines. Mark left home early, returned late, often drove without visiting friends or family, and notably tended to pull over in sparsely populated residential areas after dark. Although Mark committed no criminal act during the surveillance period, the observed pattern showed he still maintained the habit of watching women from a distance, especially those who lived alone. On 2 occasions in 3 weeks, the PSP team documented Mark parking near an apartment complex and sitting motionless in his car for more than 40 minutes, simply staring toward lighted windows. Holcomb flagged this as repeated behavior consistent with the stalking pattern described in witness statements years earlier, further reinforcing the continuity of his behavioral profile from past to present. During the surveillance, the FBI used movement analysis tools to create a daily travel map for Mark, identifying recurring stops and times when he typically altered his route. This was intended to predict the safest, most accessible locations to execute an arrest warrant without endangering the public. In parallel, PSP compiled every piece of legal evidence needed to support the arrest warrant, the 2018 forensic reports, Mark's residence and employment timeline from 1996 to 2010, new 2014 witness statements, the cross-case analysis map, soil matching results, and nanotrace fiber results. Documents were combined into a suspect dossier built on 3 clear pillars: forensics proving Mark was in the Harper backyard in 1996, behavioral and witness evidence proving a years-long stalking pattern, and timeline geographic evidence proving Mark was near every crime scene in the 5 cases. While building the case, Holcomb stressed that the arrest warrant application had to rest on the simultaneous convergence of all legal elements. Strong forensic data alone was not enough. The behavioral history and travel timeline were needed to establish reasonableness and the interconnected chain across the 5 incidents. Prosecutors worked directly with PSP to review every piece of evidence, ensuring the warrant, once issued, would face no legal obstacles. The FBI handled safety oversight and technical support, while PSP managed field data collection and forensic analysis. Ongoing internal briefings assessed risk, especially since Mark could suddenly change his behavior or leave the state. The extended covert surveillance served 2 purposes: to monitor whether Mark approached any new targets and to pinpoint a stable location and optimal timing for the arrest. After the 5th week, PSP determined that Mark routinely left home at the same time each morning and stopped at the same fixed gas station about 10 minutes before heading to work. This was deemed the ideal location: open, easily accessible, and lightly trafficked at that hour. Once the forensic behavioral timeline dossier was complete and reviewed multiple times, PSP and the prosecutors concluded there was sufficient probable cause to seek an arrest warrant for Mark Elwood, setting the stage for the decisive phase of a more than 2-decade investigation. When the arrest warrant was signed and approved in late summer 2018, Pennsylvania State Police and the FBI agreed to execute the plan early the next morning to maximize surprise and safety. At approximately 5:20 a.m., While the neighborhood was still shrouded in pre-dawn gray, the Joint Task Force approached Mark Elwood's rented house on the outskirts of Union County. Two unmarked vehicles blocked both ends of the street. One team moved in on the front door, while another sealed off the rear to prevent escape through the backyard or access to the gray sedan parked under the carport. As Mark stepped out to leave for work, officers converged, ordered him to raise his hands and get on his knees. Mark was completely taken by surprise, offered no resistance, but appeared stunned as he was handcuffed and read his Miranda rights. The entire takedown lasted only seconds, silent, precise, and exactly as rehearsed after weeks of surveillance. Immediately after Mark was secured, PSP executed the simultaneous search warrant, starting with the older sedan parked beside the house. The fated vehicle was loaded onto a flatbed and transported, sealed, directly to the state forensic lab. Priority was given to the cloth upholstery, the centerpiece of the multi-year fiber analysis. During the initial on-scene examination, technicians used angled lights to scan the seat surfaces for naturally shed fibers accumulated over years of use. They located multiple clusters of tiny fibers along seat edges, crevices, and areas of back contact, consistent with the fiber types recovered in prior cases. After collecting samples, the car was resealed under strict protocol to prevent any cross-contamination during transport. In the lab, technicians extracted individual fibers from the seats and subjected them to nanotrace fiber analysis, the same technology that had previously linked the 5 cases. When results came back, the forensic report confirmed that fibers from Mark's car seats matched 100% with every sample previously recovered from the 1996 scene items, the 2010 escapee's clothing, and the stray fibers at the Danville, Williamsport, and Selinsgrove locations. The match extended to the full nanopolymer structure, oxidation ratio, fiber break pattern, and impurity profile, creating an identical material fingerprint between Mark's vehicle and the fibers from all 5 crimes. This was not mere similarity of type, it was an absolute match that excluded any other possible source material. When the report reached Holcomb, he labeled it a highest-level match in automotive forensics, considered direct evidence linking Mark's vehicle to every crime scene in the series. Meanwhile, PSP continued examining other areas of the car, trunk, floor mats and under-seat crevices, for signs the vehicle had been used to transport or approach victims in the past. Additional fiber samples were collected for later analysis, but the seat fingerprint alone was sufficient to solidify the entire arrest case. The arrest, vehicle seizure, and examination proceeded seamlessly and rapidly, ensuring Mark was separated from any opportunity to destroy evidence or access the car. When Mark Elwood was brought to Pennsylvania State Police Headquarters, the interrogation that had been planned for months began immediately after he was placed in the interview room, a stark space containing only a steel table, 2 chairs, and recording equipment. The investigators, led by Lieutenant Ryan Holcomb, chose a strategy built on the combined weight of forensics, timeline, and behavior rather than pure psychological pressure. They opened by giving Mark a chance to explain, asking about his years living in Lewisburg, Danville, Williamsport, Selinsgrove, and Mifflinburg. Mark remained mostly silent, occasionally offering short denials, "I'm not involved," or "I don't know anything." When Holcomb shifted to the seized gray sedan, Mark described it as just an old work car, nothing special. Holcomb did not argue, he simply placed enlarged electron microscope photos of the seat fabric and the nanotrace fiber analysis report in front of Mark, explaining that fibers found on 1996 evidence, the 2010 victim's clothing, and the 3 other disappearances were an exact match to fibers from Mark's car seats. Mark sat motionless, staring at the table, his jaw twitching slightly as if struggling to stay composed. Holcomb then brought up the soil samples. Dirt on Mark's shoes in 2017 matched perfectly with soil collected from the Harper backyard in 1996. A match impossible to explain by coincidence given the unique mineral profile found only in the area where Mark worked, HVAC, and where Emily vanished. Mark closed his eyes, sighed, and repeated, "I don't know." At that point, the interviewers switched to a question and contrast technique. They laid out Mark's 1996-2010 travel map, with marks at every residence and workplace perfectly overlaying the disappearance locations. They told him plainly, "You are the only common point." For the first time Mark looked up, visibly irritated, but instead of a strong denial, he only said, "I didn't do anything." Holcomb recognized this as the moment Mark began to crack. Innocent people typically deny vigorously when faced with overwhelming evidence. Guilty parties confronted with the inexplicable often stall or minimize. The first day's interrogation lasted many hours, methodically cycling through layers of evidence: fibers, soil, left-handed indicators, stalking pattern, residence timeline, witnesses who saw Mark watching women, the 2004 illegal parking citation in Williamsport, 2007 fuel receipts near the Selinsgrove scene, and especially the behavioral match between the 2010 attempted abduction and earlier witness descriptions of Mark. By the end of the first day Mark still had not confessed, but he had shifted from flat denial to guarded, evasive responses. "I don't remember. That was a long time ago." "You might be mistaken." PSP decided to continue the next day, focusing on a single case. Emily Harper. They started by placing a 1996 photo of Emily with her family, taken shortly before she vanished, in front of Mark. He looked uncomfortable and avoided the picture, his left hand clenched. Investigators asked about that night. He denied. They asked why he used to walk the trail behind the Harper house repeatedly. He said, "Just walking." They asked why he moved suddenly right after the disappearance. He said, "Unrelated." Holcomb then set down microscope images of the soil sample, nanoscale photos of fibers from his car, and forensic notes, proving Mark was in the Harper backyard the night Emily disappeared. Then Holcomb said, "We're not asking anymore whether you did it. We're asking where Emily is." That question produced the first visible shift in Mark. Eyes reddening, hands trembling slightly, lips pressed tight as if holding words in. Not the reaction of someone wrongly accused, but of someone pushed to the edge when a secret can no longer be hidden. The session continued another 2 hours. Holcomb never shouted or threatened. He simply kept presenting forensic facts like needles tightening a noose. Then the turning point came when Holcomb placed on the table a sealed evidence bag containing an item recovered near Buffalo Valley in 1996 that modern forensics had reanalyzed. "This was found near the path you walked every night, and the fibers on it match your car. Do you want us to keep digging ourselves, or do you want to tell the truth?" Mark dropped his head, hands clenched, and for the first time said something other than denial. "I never thought it would turn out like this." The investigators stayed silent. Mark continued, voice low but clear. "I just wanted to scare her. I didn't mean to." Then he stopped. Another investigator asked, "Where is she?" Mark closed his eyes, and as if crushed by the weight of 22 years of secrecy, he said, "In the woods, north of Buffalo Valley, near the Big Rock." PSP asked for specific directions. At first vague, but when handed a map and told to mark it, Mark pointed to a deep forest area roughly 2 miles from the Harper house, along an abandoned trail unused since the late 1990s. He described a large charred tree stump, a moss-covered boulder, and a crevice where he pushed her down. The statement was detailed enough that PSP immediately dispatched a special search team with ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and crime scene forensics to the location Mark indicated. At the exact spot, they found old disturbed soil, tree roots cut by a sharp object, and upon excavation, approximately 1 meter down, human bone fragments. With the bones were faded fabric, scraps consistent with Emily's clothing, and a small metal bracelet, later identified by the family as Emily's. The entire scene was sealed and processed under long-buried remains protocol. The remains were transported to the lab for DNA analysis against family reference samples. Subsequent forensic results confirmed the remains were Emily Harper, matching perfectly with DNA from her mother and 2 other relatives. With the recovery of the remains and personal effects, Mark's statement was no longer merely a confession. It became independently verified physical evidence through forensics and excavation. PSP compiled a final case file containing new forensic evidence, the confession pinpointing the body location, physical evidence recovered at the scene, and confirmatory DNA results. This chain of data left no room for any alternative explanation. Mark Elwood was present at the scene the night Emily disappeared, led her into the woods, and concealed her body for more than 2 decades. The trial of Mark Elwood took place in late 2018 at the Union County Courthouse, where the Emily Harper case was presented to the jury amid intense media and local community attention. After the Pennsylvania State Police, PSP announced the discovery of Emily's remains after more than 2 decades missing. On the very first day, the prosecution laid out the complete structure of evidence, beginning with a full reconstruction of the timeline from 1996 to 2018, demonstrating Mark's repeated presence in the areas where 5 separate incidents occurred, while explaining the modern forensic methods that led to the decisive conclusions in the case file. The prosecution placed special emphasis on nanotrace fiber analysis, showing that fibers from Mark's car seat matched perfectly with fibers recovered from the 1996 disappearance scene, the 2010 escape incident, and 3 intermediate missing person cases. They presented nanoscale magnified images, polymer fingerprint charts, and comparison reports indicating that the probability of the fibers coming from any source other than Mark's vehicle was so low as to be considered impossible. Next, the prosecution introduced the 2018 soil match evidence, showing that soil on Mark's shoes was an exact match to soil collected from the Harper family's backyard in 1996, using trace mineral analysis, serpentine, chrysotyl crystal patterning, and characteristic oxide fingerprints unique to the area where Mark had worked HVAC and the exact location where Emily vanished. These 2 forensic pillars, when combined, proved that Mark was not merely among the possible suspects, but the only individual present at the right place at the right time, according to scientific evidentiary standards. Following the forensic portion, the prosecution presented behavioral evidence. 2014 witness testimony describing Mark stalking women over multiple years. Mark's travel patterns matching every disappearance. A 2004 parking ticket in Williamsport. Fuel purchase records corresponding to the Selinsgrove incident area in 2007. And the left-handed perpetrator description from the 2010 escape case, matching Mark's medical records. Combining forensic, behavioral, and timeline evidence, the prosecution portrayed Mark as operating according to a clear pattern, approaching victims near their homes. Using darkness, leaving no signs of forced entry, rapidly gaining control of the victim, and leaving the scene in a gray sedan. When presenting the most critical piece of evidence, Mark's statements during interrogation, the prosecutor read verbatim the portion where he admitted taking her into the woods north of Buffalo Valley, and marked the exact burial location on a map. The PSP was then called to testify, describing the excavation process, the recovery of Emily's remains and personal belongings, including fabric scraps, a bracelet, and surrounding soil samples that matched the 1996 samples. Final DNA forensics were presented, confirming 100% that the remains belonged to Emily Harper based on comparisons with samples from her mother and brother. Mark Elwood's defense attorney attempted to counter by arguing that the fiber and soil forensics only proved presence, not criminal action. They tried to claim Mark was near the Harper home for HVAC work reasons and that fibers could have transferred under other circumstances. The prosecution immediately rebutted, Mark was not performing HVAC work at the time of Emily's disappearance. The polymer fingerprint match was absolute, and Mark's statement revealing the body location constituted direct evidence that could not be explained by innocent hypotheses. Defense counsel also attacked the partial confession, claiming Mark was under interrogation pressure, but the recorded interrogation video showed Mark voluntarily disclosing the burial site without coercion or threats, and he provided topographic details only the person who placed the body there could know. When the prosecution played footage of the PSP excavation team recovering remains exactly where Mark had indicated, the courtroom fell almost completely silent. the defense arguments lost all weight. The jury was instructed to evaluate the entire chain of evidence according to 3 criteria: 1. Independent forensic proof, 2. Statements consistent with the physical scene, 3. Consistent behavioral pattern across 2 decades. After 4 days of trial proceedings and 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom with a unanimous verdict. When polled, the foreperson stated, "We didn't just find that Mark Elwood was present at the scene, we found he was the only person who could have caused the entire chain of events." The court convicted Mark Elwood of kidnapping resulting in death, along with related charges of concealing a corpse and obstruction of justice. As the judge read the sentence, Mark sat motionless and expressionless. Based on the severity of the conduct, the decades-long duration of the crime, the deliberate concealment, and the calculated nature revealed by the forensic evidence, Mark Elwood was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. With this verdict, the Emily Harper file, one of the longest-running and most mysterious missing person cases in Pennsylvania, was officially resolved after 22 years. As the trial concluded, the prosecutor declared, "The truth always exists. It only waits to be uncovered." The PSP issued an official statement that the Emily Harper case was closed with status solved, ending an investigative journey that spanned more than 2 decades, from the morning a family discovered an empty bedroom to the trial where every piece of evidence finally converged to bring the perpetrator to justice. In the story of the Emily Harper case, many details reflect very real issues in contemporary American life, from the hidden dangers in seemingly peaceful communities to the essential role of modern investigative technology, personal vigilance, and the importance of community cooperation in missing person cases. One major lesson drawn from the story is this: predators are not always obvious, and sometimes they are the very people living right next door, like Mark Elwood, a quiet, unassuming neighbor with no prior record who turned out to be the central link in a chain of disappearances spanning more than 2 decades. In today's America, tranquil neighborhoods are not always absolutely safe, and paying attention to unusual behavior, such as a man frequently sitting in his car, watching women's homes, or someone repeatedly appearing in deserted areas at night, can play a crucial role in preventing crime. Another detail from the story is the 2010 escape incident, in which the victim was dragged into a gray sedan right in front of her own house. This serves as a powerful reminder of the risk of attack in safe blind spots, driveways, parking lots, dark walkways. In reality today in the United States, assaults in residential areas or parking lots are not rare, and adopting better self-protection habits like staying aware of surroundings, avoiding headphones while walking alone, or installing lighting and security cameras around the home can make a life-or-death difference. The story also demonstrates that modern forensic technology has the power to break decades-old deadlocks, but only when initial evidence is carefully preserved and the community cooperates. This underscores the importance of reporting every suspicion, preserving crime scenes, and never ignoring small signs. Ultimately, the greatest lesson from the Emily Harper case is justice may come late, but it requires persistence, community vigilance, and never giving up while the truth remains hidden. Thank you for following the entire journey of solving the Emily Harper case. If this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next mysterious case files. See you in the next video, where we'll continue uncovering the truth behind cases that seem destined to be forgotten.